Good evening. Thanks for joining us for our first installment of our Engage 2020 summer series. Over the next few weeks, we will have historians, professors, activists, and community members offering thought-provoking virtual programs around important civic issues. And tonight we have historian Brenda Tindal here with us. Not only is Ms. Tindal an award-winning educator, scholar, and museum practitioner, she's a Charlotte native. She currently serves as Director of Education and Engagement at the International African American Museum in Charleston, South Carolina. Her previous positions include Director of Education at the Detroit Historical Society and Staff Historian and Senior Vice President of Research and Collections at the Levine Museum of the New South here in Charlotte, where she was the first woman and African American to serve in these roles. So without further ado, I welcome Brenda Tindal.
Thank you so much, Walker. I really appreciate that very thoughtful introduction. And I also want to extend my gratitude to the library for extending this opportunity and also offering this kind of digital programming for the Charlotte and your virtual community. I'm just so delighted to participate.
Thank you. We're happy to have you.
Absolutely. And we're going to have questions at the very end of the presentation. And so I'd like to begin with my PowerPoint. As you can tell, the title of my presentation is Sister Soldiers, African American Women, and the Long Civil and Human Rights Movement. I always like to begin presentations by asking broad questions before we jump into the formal presentation. And so my opening question is to the virtual audience: who or what comes to mind when you think about the civil rights movement? I'd love to hear your responses, and you can send them right away. Again, that question is: who or what comes to mind when you think about the civil rights movement? And I'll wait for just a second to see if we get any responses from our virtual audience. Who or what comes to mind when you think about the civil rights movement? Thank you, Mimi Curley. Mimi offers Dr. Martin Luther King and marches as a response to our opening question. Marion McMahon offers Rosa Parks. Any other takers? Megan Kiefer also offers Rosa Parks. And Eileen Paruff offers Dr. King, W.E.B. Du Bois, and Frederick Douglass. Estelle Jenkins offers Reverend Al Sharpton, Reverend Jesse Jackson, and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Many thanks for everyone that responded to that question. I always like to ask those questions because in many ways the civil rights movement is one of the most iconic social reform movements in the world. And so often our understanding of the civil rights movement is indeed the sort of towering figures like the likes of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. There's also typically a reference to blockbuster events like the March on Washington. Oftentimes the civil rights movement is captured within the context of the halcyon decades that defined it, roughly the 1950s through the 1960s. And then, of course, there is a tendency to understand the civil rights movement within the South and the ways in which the movement was responding to social and political issues in that region. And many historians, including the likes of Jacqueline Dowd Hall, have framed this sort of criteria, if you will, as part of the classical civil rights movement. And as you noted from the title of my presentation, it was really important for me to not only leverage the civil rights movement, but really to leverage this idea of the long civil rights and human rights movement. So I want to offer just a bit of a meditation, if you will, on why talking about the long human rights movement and the role that African American women played in that struggle is important. I offer it in many ways as a counter narrative and/or as an alternate to our sort of standard articulation of the civil rights movement. In my view, so often, as indicated on the last slide, the civil rights movement is understood as having been bookended, if you will, between the Brown v. Board of Education of 1954, which we know led to important reform in our education system, opening up our public schools to a more diverse and integrated student population. There are some nuances to that story, and I won't go into details here, but that's typically understood as the start of the civil rights movement. The end of the civil rights movement, if you will, is marked by the landmark legislation, the Voting Rights Act, the Civil Rights Act, as well as the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. In some ways, people have argued that the civil rights movement, that classical civil rights movement that we just discussed, ended with the death of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. What I argue is that if we are to understand the civil rights movement and really its broader implications, I want to leverage the long civil rights, the long civil and human rights movement and the ways in which it will help reimagine how we think about African American women and their contributions to the larger social and political movements. This is particularly important as this year marks the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment and women's voting rights, but it also marks a critical turning point in the ways in which we should be imagining and meditating and even taking action in the name of civil and human rights. For the purposes of this presentation, I just want to highlight 3 reasons why understanding the long civil rights movement in the context of African American women and their political activism is important. In my view, when we begin to reframe social reform work within the context of the long civil and human rights movement, it helps us reimagine, quote, what issues were a catalyst for Black women's civic, social, and political activism? How would I framed as these sister soldiers, in other words, women who marched not even behind or in front of, but beside their African American male counterparts and other activists? How did these sister soldiers position and or fashion themselves within social and political discourse? And then finally, why African American women's voices and perspective are critical to a broader understanding of the struggle for civil and human rights. And so I offer those sets of questions as a way to begin to reimagine the long civil and human rights movement and African American women. So I want to begin with, it seems right that if you know me, you know that Sojourner Truth is one of my muses, one of my idols. And I think that she offers a really important example of the ways in which African American women's activism certainly predated the classical civil rights movement. And most importantly, it demonstrates the ways in which African American women entered American public life long before those particularly important moments in American history. Sojourner Truth in particular, which if you know her story, you know that she was a formerly enslaved woman in New York. She emerged as one of the early voices of the women's rights movement. She was an itinerant preacher and certainly an advocate of women's voting rights. And a critical moment in the ways in which she entered the public imagination was in 1851. And in 1851, in Akron, Ohio, Sojourner Truth stepped upon the stage at a women's rights convention before a largely all-white audience. And if you can just imagine the climate, it's pre-emancipation, right? It's in 1851, so it's prior to the start of the Civil War, prior to the end of the institution of slavery. And this courageous African-American woman decides to mount the podium. And she delivered what is, in many ways, one of the most important public addresses of the 19th century. And if you'll allow me, I'd like to share her words. I think her words tell us so much about the ways in which African-American women helped inform and added a great deal of power to the concerns that impacted not only women, but African-Americans in the struggle for suffrage and civil and human rights. And so just if you could close your eyes for just a second and imagine this. It is 1851. We are in Akron, Ohio, and the air is thick in the room. And Sojourner Truth steps on the stage, and this is what she says. That man over there said that a woman needs to be helped in the carriages and lifted over ditches, and to have the best place everywhere you see. Nobody ever helped me in the carriages or over mud puddles or gives me a best place. And ain't I a woman? Look at me. Look at my arm, you see. Eyes are plowed and planted and gathered into barns. And you know what? No man could head me. And ain't I a woman? I could work as much and eat as much as a man if I could get to it, and bear the lash as well. And ain't I a woman? I've borne 13 children and seen most all born into slavery. But when I cried out of mother's grief, none but Jesus heard me. And ain't I a woman? That man in black there said that a woman can't have as much rights as a man because Christ wasn't a woman. Well, where did your Christ come from? From God and a woman. Man had nothing to do with him. If the first woman God ever made was strong enough to turn the world upside down all alone, together, women ought to be able to turn it right side up again. And then she walked off the stage. And in that moment, Sojourner Truth made clear the issues and the struggles of African Americans and the triple burdens of African American women. I share that again as an example of the ways in which African American women entered the national imagination and again moved the needle on some of the most important issues of that era. For Sojourner Truth, certainly women's rights, African American liberation and emancipation, and certainly the clarion call for voting rights was particularly a feature of her Ain't I a Woman address. And so I offer her as yet an example of the ways in which when we begin to reimagine the civil and human rights struggle, it's not enough to situate it as something that occurred within a 10-year time span in the 1950s and 1960s. When we do so, we miss the voice and perspective and the struggles that women like Sojourner Truth added a great deal of value to. So I'm sort of jumping from 1851 to the classical period of the civil rights movement proper. And it's not to dismiss the many women, particularly African American women, that informed the social and political movements between the Civil War and the civil rights movement proper. But the ways in which African American women often enter the national imagination, one could argue it's really through in these very dramatic and tragic ways. And I would argue Mamie Till Bradley, also known as Mamie Till Mobley, the mother of Emmet Till, is one of the single most important women to help usher in the modern civil rights movement. You'll note the images that I've selected are pretty intentional. Some of you may know the story of Emmet Till. It would be painful for me to cast his image at this moment, particularly in light of some of the real challenges and some of the real spectacle, visibility, and the consistent amount of violence and frankly, Black suffering that we've witnessed in the last few weeks here. So I will not show the image of Emmet Till's body as he was murdered in Mississippi in 1955. And I show this picture of him alive because I think it's important that we remember that Emmet Till was a whole and full person before he became this monstrous image that reminded us of the horrors of racism and the horrors of what it meant to be a Black child in the South. And a Black person in the South in the middle of the 20th century. But again, I show these images because I wanted to show an image of Emmet Till next to his mother in happier times. The middle image is her at his final burial rites. And then the last one is Mamie Till Bradley addressing an audience after the funeral. Mamie Till's entry into American public life and her contributions to the civil and human rights movement literally, transformed her positionality in private and in public. She literally went from mother to mourner to movement. Now, let's just think about what happened to Emmet Till. We know that Emmet Till, who was a teenager, from all accounts, very precocious, is excited about going to Money, Mississippi for the summer. He and his mother lived in Chicago. And as his mother is putting him on the train in Chicago to send him to Money, Mississippi, we likely, and she could have never imagined that she would never see her full son upon it, when he returned. Because when he returned in a pine box. But in sending Emmet to Mississippi, one of the last things Mamie Till said to him he was so excited about getting on the train. She said to him, "Oh, are you not going to give me a hug, before you leave?" And he said, "Oh, Mama." And she had given him a ring that was a ring that had his father's initials in it. His father was a veteran, and she had given it to him, and really as a symbol of family. And Emmet Till went off to Money, Mississippi, to spend time with his family there. A little while into his time in Mississippi, as the story goes, Emmet and his cousins went to a convenience store in Money, Mississippi, and an exchange occurred between Emmet and the wife of the store owner. And whatever that exchange was, led to a pretty violent response. In the middle of the night, Emmet, who was actually staying with his uncle Moses, was likely startled as the store owner and an accomplice comes and bangs on Uncle Moses's door. And they asked, "Where's the boy from Chicago who did all that talking?" And as a result, they enter the home. They walk through the home, turning over the other sheets on the beds, and they find Emmet, and Emmet is taken with them. And he never returns. When Emmet is finally discovered, his body floats up from the Tallahatchie River, bloated. He has obviously been violently attacked. And the only way they were able to tell that it was even him was because of the ring on his hand, which had his father's initials on it. Now, Mamie Till probably was not only frightened, but devastated by news of Emmett's death, the way he died. And when asked, the Mississippi officials wanted to actually bury Emmet without Mamie Till really being able to see her son. And it was because of her commitment to ensuring that her son got a proper funeral. She asked them to make sure that they sent her son from Mississippi to Chicago. And she was asked to not open that casket. Now imagine the inhumanity of a mother receiving her son in a pine box and being asked not to open it. But in a state of courage, Mamie Till said, "Open the box. I have to make sure that that is my son." And that would become the single most important moment in visualizing for the American public, again, why the mounting civil and human rights movement was important. She decided, I want to have an open casket funeral so that I can show the world what they've done to my boy. And in many ways, in tandem, Emmet Till and his mother emerged as both the sacrificial lamb and the organ of the new civil rights movement. I share Mamie Till's story because so often we forget the courage and the important ways in which she helped usher in a new generation of social and political activism. And so Mamie Till is again a woman who I think deserves to be captured. Her story, Emmett's story, deserves to be captured within the context of the long civil and human rights movement. I moved to some other examples of African-American women who have been very much part of the story of the classical civil rights movement, and whose stories, like Mamie Till Bradley, are tragic. Myrlie Evers Williams, Betty Shabazz, and Coretta Scott King really emerged in the sort of national imagination as what I call movement widows. And by movement widows, I'm really referring to women whose husbands were martyred during the classical sort of civil rights movement. And they really become these paragons of bereavement, but most importantly, they emerged as these torchbearers for their husbands. Myrlie Evers is the widow of Medgar Evers, who was the first field secretary of the National Association of African Americans, excuse me, for the NAACP in Mississippi. Forgive me. Betty Shabazz was the wife turned widow of Malcolm X, who was one of the most controversial and important leaders of the Black Muslim movement. And then there is, of course, Coretta Scott King, who is the wife turned widow of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. In many ways, this sort of the political assassinations of Medgar Evers, Malcolm X, and Martin Luther King Jr. Framed the tragedy of the modern civil rights movement in some really distinct ways. One could argue that Coretta Scott King really emerges as the dean of movement widowhood. And part of that is because there's this sort of hierarchy as it relates to martyrdom. Medgar Evers is technically, at least in the national imagination, much more of a regional leader, as he led the NAACP in Mississippi. Malcolm X, to some, is a bit of a pariah figure because of his spiritual and religious beliefs, and quite frankly, many thought that his views were caustic, or at the very least, far more difficult to understand, particularly in comparison to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And then Dr. King, as you can see from the Life magazine photo of Mrs. King, the America, says farewell in anger and grief. It spoke to the iconicity of an individual like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and his impact on the larger, and I would even say the global civil rights movement. In my personal opinion, I think Medgar Evers, Malcolm X, and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. all made critical contributions to the global civil and human rights movement. And their wives were left, in some ways, with the responsibility of continuing to preserve that legacy. I bring the movement widow to the fore here, in part because I believe it's not enough, again, to imagine Myrlie Evers, Betty Shabazz, or Coretta Scott King as simply the widows of martyred civil rights leaders. In particular, Myrlie Evers and Betty Shabazz, they do emerge and are much more politicized in the aftermath of their husbands' deaths. But I would argue that Coretta Scott King, her legacy of and her heritage of civil and human rights activism predates, emerged in a robust manner during the modern and contemporary civil rights movement, and in many ways proceeded long after the assassination of Dr. King. And so I want to hone in just a bit on Coretta Scott King to just give you a sense of the breadth of her activism and why it is difficult to simply imagine her as what what she called more than the ceremonial symbol. Just as some quick highlights, you'll note that I've bookended her arc of human and civil rights activism between the 1940s and 2006 when she passed. These are just some of the civil and human rights struggles, movements, social reform efforts that Coretta Scott King was engaged in. We know that she was an important stakeholder and activist during the civil rights movement. We also know that she was very active in the peace and anti-war movement, welfare and anti-poverty struggles, women's rights, the anti-apartheid struggle, and the LGBTQ movement. And those are just, again, none of that does complete justice to all of the varying ways that Coretta Scott King helped transform national, local, national, and global conversations regarding civil and human rights. I think it's important to also note, I use the civil rights movement very broadly here. Coretta Scott King, her work as a civil rights activist preceded meeting Dr. King and marrying him and then being engaged in the civil rights movement. And I say that in particular because so many think that Coretta Scott King's activism began as a result of her marriage to Dr. King. But if we look at the record, if we look at the historical record, Coretta Scott King was deeply involved in the 1940s with the progressive movement. She was involved with the NAACP. We may even look to her academic trajectory. She went to the Lincoln School in Marion, Alabama, which was really informed by Quakerism and early ideas around human rights. She actually interfaced with Bayard Rustin, who was one of the architects of the March on Washington. She interfaced with him as a high school student at the Lincoln School. And that completely predates, the record suggests that Coretta Scott King met and was, sort of interfacing with some of the most important civil and human rights activists before Dr. King even engaged with them. And so I offer Coretta Scott King and really some of the ways in which her ideology and her work around social and political activism evolved. I offer just some details around her evolution between the 1940s and 1950s. It's just a testament to the ways in which she was not new to civil rights and human rights, but true to it long before the classical civil rights movement. Now, I worried that I would go a bit over time, and so I was asked to speak for about 30 minutes so that we can actually have some dialogue as a virtual community about the civil and human rights movements that we've discussed and the roles in which African American women play in those movements. I'd like to offer some time to open up for live comments and Q&A. If my colleague Walker could rejoin me to begin the Q&A portion of the conversation, I'd greatly appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you, Brenda. That was great. Anyone have any questions? Okay, we've got a question here from Jenna. Do you suggest any resources for diving deeper into the stories of these women?
Absolutely. I think for one of the things that we can do is, again, use the long civil rights movement as a way to begin to interrogate who, how, what women were doing during these larger, struggles for social reform. The other thing that I think is particularly important is, again, thinking about women's activism beyond sort of traditional modes of activism. So for instance, we might think of someone like Teresa Elder in Charlotte, who in many ways is a trailblazer, becomes one of the first African-American nurses, right? But what if we thought about her activism, the work that she did in the community right off of Sugar Creek, for instance, and trying to reform and ensure that community was healthy in terms of the water supply. In some ways, we might understand her as an environmental activist in a particular way. But those stories in some ways become marginalized because our imagination around civil and human rights can be very narrow. And so my suggestion is, again, to think outside of the box. And there's a great amount of scholarship related to women's activism. I can certainly provide a list of amazing texts for women in the civil rights movement, but the larger human rights movement. Happy to provide that. I think that was Jenna who asked that question.
Sure, and we can post that later in this in the comments section for anyone that would like to see that. Okay, we've got another good question from Mimi. She says, who do you think is a current African-American woman in the civil rights movement, someone that we should be following?
Oh, my goodness, so many. Bree Newsom, who I think, her heroic activism in the aftermath of the Mother Emanuel massacre really stands to me as one of the most important symbols of contemporary civil rights, human rights activism. That courage, I think, is one to be monumentalized. There are also women who, again, aren't necessarily, framed as activists, but the mothers of the men and women who have been the victims of police-involved fatalities. They're activists too. In some ways, they belong to a lineage of mourning mothers and widows, much like the women I've discussed here, Emmetts Till and Myrlie Evers and Betty Shabazz and Coretta Scott King. And so they have really sought to address some critical issues around police brutality, but around issues of equity and race that I think is critical. The founders of the Black Lives Matters movement are critical. And even women who aren't necessarily activists, but are political voices. I would argue, Michelle Obama, for instance, would be an ideal sort of example of someone who is challenging the discourse and using her platform in a provocative and yet in a way that is accessible and admirable. So those would be some examples I would offer.
Thank you. Okay, Jenny Geisbauer's got an interesting question down here. Who would you like Biden to pick it as his VP?
Woo. You already know the answer, Jenny. Abrams, all day. All day. Stacey Abrams. I think she is masterful in the ways in which she navigates these critical times. She is young, thoughtful. I think she brings a legitimacy to national politics that is worth. I want to see her in the summit of power. I want to see her in the summit of power. She is striking and important to the 21st century.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions? Jenny says thank you for that.
Oh,
Anyone else?
I do want to add one other thought here. As a historian, one of my philosophy has always been that it's important that we make interventions in the stories that we tell. And I think institutions like the Levine Museum of the New South and the Gantt are doing a fantastic job. So are so many other cultural institutions, including the library, are doing a really important job, a really great job at ensuring that the stories they tell are diverse, that they're thoughtful, and that they bring people into the narrative who have previously been elided. My philosophy as a historian, again, is that it's drawn from I ran across, I was working on the Alice Walker papers at Emory University probably about 10 years ago. And as we were processing Alice Walker's papers, there was a little sticky note written in her long hand. And that sticky note said that people are known by the records they keep. If it isn't in the record, it will be said that it did not happen. That's what history is, keeping a record. And so, to the question about how do we continue to learn more about those women, I think we not only have to search the record, but we have to preserve those records. We have to make sure that the story of civil and human rights isn't limited to the amazing men and martyrs who have been center stage in that story. We have to make sure that women, and especially African-American women, that their stories, that their heritage, that their records are preserved for posterity. And so that will be one of the other strategies, is museums and libraries play an important role at helping to preserve historical records. I hope we will continue to do the same as it relates to individuals and collectives that haven't been part of the traditional or master telling of our history.
Okay, I think we've got time for one more, and I think this is a good one to end on. How can we take this information to help heal our country? It's a big question.
Gosh, I've also been thinking a lot about that. And a few weeks ago, CNN commentator Bakari Sellers said that justice has to be a verb. And I can't agree more. The reality is it's not enough to intellectualize the history, to read all of the scholarship related to equity and inclusion, and Charlotte, we know we do such a good job of establishing task force in response to, critical community issues. But how do we make sure that we not only intellectualize, we not only create opportunities to dialogue, but we use that dialogue as a catalyst for systems change, right? And so figuring out one of the things I think is absolutely critical is forums like this, where you have a diversity of people hearing from diverse voices, and the richness and diversity of a place like Charlotte. Bringing people together across their silos is the first step. But then we have to also figure out, how do we capitalize on having all of that brain trust in one room, so that we can develop the kind of community that is healthy, that's equitable, and that is addressing real issues. The reality is there is a clarion call for a more anti-racist community practice. And we do that by having all of the community's voices at the table so that we can create a much more equitable and safe community for all of her residents.
Thank you. Okay, I think that's all the time we have tonight. Thank you so much, Brenda. This was so interesting. I feel like we all learned a lot of new things, and you told it in such an engaging way. So we really appreciate you being here. And thank you to everyone who joined us tonight and kept this conversation going. And thanks for being engaged. Also, I'd like to mention that next Tuesday, June 23rd at 7 p.m., historian Tom Hanchett will be joining us to talk about women changing Charlotte. So please tune in to our Facebook page again next week. And we hope to see you there. Thank you again, Brenda.
Thank you, Charlotte. I miss you all deeply, and continue to do the good work. Continue to do the good work. Thank you so much to the Charlotte Mecklenburg Library for an opportunity to engage and commune with Charlotte this evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, guys.